Today, I want us to talk about Sustainable Development Goal 4. This goal, in summary, is to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education for everyone. It is also aimed at promoting lifelong learning opportunities for all by 2030. According to UNESCO, Sub-Saharan Africa has the highest of education exclusion. Over 1/5 of children between the ages of about 6 and 11 are out of school. They are followed by 1/3 of youth between the ages of 12 and 14. And the statistics goes on and on. It is clear that much more needs to be done to ensure inclusivity, especially for children in restive areas. As much as the subject of inclusivity is important, today our focus for discussion is on the quality of education. How has it changed over the years? How is the taught curricula linked to the national and even continental values and needs? Or are we still practicing what was handed down to us many, many years ago? If these questions have piqued your interest in the subject matter, they have mine too. My name is Keminni Amanor, and you're welcome to the square. Joining our gathering today are Adetunji Ogunyemi. He's Associate Professor of Economic History at the Obafemi Awolowo University, Ile-Ife in Nigeria. We also have Abdulateef Adetunji, who's here with me in the studio. He's an educationist and a flipped classroom expert. And then all the way from East Africa, we have Macharia Munene. He's Professor of International Relations at the United States International University in Nairobi, Kenya. Gentlemen, you're welcome to the square. I'll start with you. Absolutely. I'll start with you, Professor Ogunyemi. Let's talk about pre-colonial education. Before the influx of Christianity and Islam, what was the African education or traditional education like?
Each community had an educational system. The purpose of that educational system was to train its the youth, to protect its perceived values, identity, and various interests, and to advance them in such a way that they will not be jeopardized. So education was for people to reproduce themselves into the future. And to do that, the young have to be taught. And the people who did the teaching were usually grandparents who had gone through it, and they knew what was good and what was not good. And in that teaching, the youth were taught what the do's and do nots are. They were taught how to think for themselves and the community so that they are productive. So the education was both in terms of practicality, the day-to-day things, and in terms of the conceptual, in terms of thinking of how to do things and move forward. So it was not just one or the other, it was a combination of those things. Then we noticed that in the process, there were layers of education because there were stages in the growth of the person. So from the baby, when they are little ones, of course, they'll get a different type of education until they get the adolescence, in which then they will start getting special attention. If they are girls, they'll get special attention pertaining to women. And if they are boys, they'll get special attention pertaining to potential men. And when they go through some rituals, those rituals were actually educational institutions where values were inculcated. And they were told, if you are now an adult, almost an adult, there are things you do not do, and there are things you do. So those values and how to protect them, the belief system that they had acquired were very important in the education system of those people. So they were able to ask questions, to refrain from getting lost. Of course, not every African society are the same, but the principles are the same. In terms, there are those who may be said, were somehow more democratically inclined than those that were more monarchical inclined. But in either case, you have, they each had an education system that was supposed to protect, advance, and promote or sustain, perpetuate their system themselves as they saw it.
I see.
It was not to inculcate and borrow other people's systems, because then you lose your identity.
Very well.
Protecting identity was critical.
Professor Monene, I'd have you hold the rest of your thoughts for now. Professor Ogunyemi has joined our conversation again. And Prof, I was asking earlier, in fact, the first question was for you, but we lost you there for a bit. Now, talk to us about what the pillars of education were then compared to, maybe not the comparison yet. Just tell us, what were the pillars of education back then, Professor?
Thank you for having me. I assume that you can hear me perfectly now.
We do now.
Oh, excellent. Now, in the pre-colonial times, the society was an open laboratory. Open laboratory to the extent that the learning and the teaching procedures were done by people who themselves were participant observers in the things that they taught. In other words, it was experiential. A child, for example, will learn the skills as well as the basic knowledge in respect of the profession and career of his parents. So if you were brought up, for example, or if you were born by a hunter, you will learn hunting experientially. In other words, by way of observation of your parents and the things that they say to you with respect to that passion. That was pre-colonial Africa. Essentially experiential, because people were taught not only to look at issues from the perspectives of observation, but also to think for themselves. In other words, the emphasis was not on remembering. It was not on how to remember, which is what is bedeviling the current Western system. You are only taught to remember so that you could write an exam and pass it. And after the exam, as to how it applies to your real life situation, the educational system today does not have any solution. So in the pre-colonial system, it was experiential. People experienced the learning, and they were taught to think by themselves, for themselves, and to protect the environment, particularly the environment.
When you look at how education is compartmentalized now, and we're put in classrooms according to what they think you know, and very recently according to your ages, were there classrooms back then, Professor Ogunyemi?
That was why I used the word open laboratory. The whole community, because it took a whole village to train a child. A child was never trained by his biological parents alone, but the whole of the village was his classroom. It was experiential. It was an open laboratory in which you will be taught the rules, the principles, the ethics, and the etiquette of his community first. Second, how to live on and protect the environment, particularly the natural environment. And then, of course, there was no compartmentalization as to what you are taught, whether it is history or it is culture or it is science, but all these are taught together in an open laboratory mostly by the elders, and certainly by those elders who could show examples.
There are those who would argue that, and I want us to look at the quality then and now. There are those who would argue that, look, all of us here having this conversation went through the Western style education for the most part of our lives, at least for me. So how would you then make a case that perhaps the previous way of education is what Africa needs compared to the Western style, which we are practicing, hook, line, and sinker? Professor Monene.
Colonial education system had insistence on values what in Nairobi, in Kiswahili, we say utu, the humanness of the person, that does not get lost. And the person grows to become a full human being with thinking capabilities, knows what is right or wrong, insists on fairness or justice, what sometimes we call kehoto, in the way you do things. You do things unfairly, people will be very angry with you because it will imply that you do not know who you are or what value there is in the community, in the group. Now, what happened with the onset of colonialism, the creation of the colonial state, its purpose was to produce functionaries who are not thinkers. In fact, it was an offense for Africans, often called natives, to show they could think, because thinking was supposed to be obliterated from their heads. All they were supposed to do is to become mechanical technicians, that they are good carpenters, they are good plumbers, they are good this and this, but they are not supposed to think. So we have that distinction, that once it came, the purpose of that education was not to advance and promote African interests and values, it was to turn the African person into a tool for the advancement of the colonial state. And that is part of the reason why the division occurred, that people were told that they were just natives, as long as they obeyed and did what they were supposed to do. And they served the colonial state. The minute they started thinking, they were said to be dangerous. And then that explains actually why we have had repeated commissions reevaluating the education being given to the African. Because somewhere along the calculations, something will go wrong because people will think, and then they are told that's not your job. You're not supposed to think. You just become a tool, a mechanical tool. So you will notice even today, one of the dangerous things that keeps on going on is for the youth to be told repeatedly that they do not need to know, to take subjects that teach them about values, their history, the philosophy, the literature. They are told they are not supposed to do that. They should go and do something else mechanical. And that's very dangerous. Because what it means that people lose their humanity, their utu. And then we end up borrowing thinkers from outside, outsourcing thinkers. I think it may go back to what Du Bois complained about very early in the 20th century. People being told, yes, it's good, we need all these people who can do these things. But to tell people they should not think, they should not study thinking, or be able to think for themselves and take so-called those subjects.
We'll talk more about the impact. And Professor Ogunyemi, I'll have you take a bite of that question in a moment. But let's bring in Abdulateef, who's here with me in the studio. Abdulateef, I saw you nod when I posed the question that tried to compare educational quality then and now. I'd like to hear your thoughts. What do you think about the current education system?
Okay, so just as Professor Munena has rightly said, the current education, which actually come from the colonial masters, was to just produce native that can help further the agenda of the colonial masters, and not just to give us the opportunity to think for ourselves, but just to be a tool in their own industry to work for them. But then when we compare this quality with the quality that we had before the colonial masters, I would say there's a bit different, because the purpose of education now is not really the purpose of education then. The purpose of education then, before the colonial era, was to, we sustain our environment. Then there's nothing like globalization. Every country, every community for their own. It's just for us to survive on our own. But then when the colonial masters came, and then they started, they feel like, okay, we need people that can also help us do some things. So they introduced education, which was just for us to be able to further their agenda and not be able to do anything for ourselves. But then from there, we started seeing people that started feeling like this should not be so. We started thinking, which the colonial master sees as a threat. And before then, it leads to calling for independence, and then most of the African countries gain independence. But then in this system and age now, what has happened. Because the colonial master has come and gone, though their presence is still much felt here. But then what matters now is that the quality of education that we have now, the purpose of education right now is now for us to produce like students or produce learners, citizens that don't just even think alone now, just think for themselves alone. But they can also be able to self-sufficient for themselves. Because we have been depending so much right now, the education system they lay down for us, which was not to enable us to think, is still what we are still following till date. So that's why the dependency that was there then, though they are leading us, ruling us in our country then, but now it seems like they are still ruling us, but now in their own
Would you
country.
consider that the problem of the current education, the core problem of the current education system?
Yeah, it's part of it.
Part of it. And that's why we're having this conversation. Try to link what we had back then to now and see how we can marry the two. Professor Ogunyemi, and this is why you come in. There are those who think that the traditional education then, and I'm using traditional advisedly because that was our education before, everything else happened. They think that the education we had back then really isn't to be called education because we didn't sit in classrooms. Now, and so I want us to talk about what literacy is. Were we writing our languages back then? Were we doing maths back then? When we talked about University of Timbuktu, 900 CE thereabout, what were they doing? Because I've had arguments with friends and I tell them, we had a university before they came. And the question that follows is, okay, were they in the classroom? What were they doing? And I don't have an answer to that. Can you help, Professor Ogunyemi?
Assessing the quality of any type of education must factor into the calculus the environment and the purpose for which that education is designed. For example, if your education is designed for materialism, designed for the purposes of creating wealth, stupendous wealth, creating surpluses in the system, ensuring mass production of some goods and services, of course, you will measure that education with respect to the capacity to produce entrepreneurship and things that has to do with science and technology. That's how you measure the quality. But if your education is designed to produce the good citizen, the responsible husband and woman, the responsible and God-fearing, if you like, people who will maintain a society, not an intelligent devil, a person that will be so intelligent that will have the capacity to evolve or develop a weapon that can wipe out the whole humanity. That kind of education was not what in the pre-colonial times our fathers emphasized. They emphasized humanity, the humane. They emphasized issues that has to do with interpersonal relationship, not going to war unnecessarily. Issues that has to do with preserving the environment and ensuring that the ecology was balanced. So, for example, our fathers taught us fishing, but not fishing with trawlers, fishing using nets, using hooks, using canoes, yes, at some time, but certainly not using trawlers or harvesters that will harvest both the young, the juveniles, as well as the adult species, so that within a period of 10 years, you wipe out the good species in the system, and the ecological balance is distorted. That was not the kind of education we had. So, talking about which one was better, no, you do not begin to compare whether it is better to die by fire or it's better to die by gunshots. Mm-hmm. Certainly the kind of education we had in the pre-colonial system was the human kind of education. And the one we have now is the non-personal, if you like, very individualistic, utterly selfish, but nonetheless, highly materially productive. And you cannot take that away from the current type of education. So the issue is that Africa is yet to key into the current mass production kind of education in which materialism and not humanity is key.
And that's what I want us to talk about when we come back, how we can put in our own values and needs in the current dispensation of education that we have. Stay with us here on The Square. We'll be right back with this very important conversation. Don't go away. On the program today, we have learned that we had a really spectacular kind of education before colonialism, before the influx of Islam and Christianity in this part of the world. And right now we have adopted hook, line and sinker, Western style of education. But how do we find ourselves within that is the focus of our second part of the discussion today. And still with me are Abdulateef Adetunji. He's an education and a flipped classroom expert. He's here with me in the studio. Over Zoom, Professor Adetunji Ogunyemi. He's an associate professor of economic history at the Obafemi, Awolowo University, Ile-Ife in Nigeria. We also have from East Africa, Nairobi, Kenya, Professor Keminni Amanor. He is a professor of international relations at the United States International University. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your patience. And I'll start here in the studio with me. We have been trying to make comparisons, okay, between what we had then and now. You're a flipped education expert. Yes. Talk to us about what flipped is, because I was telling you earlier, I feel that is what we used to do before they gave us the style.
Okay, so basically what the flipped classroom is starting with the word itself, flipped. So flip means we invert something, we turn things upside down. That means we do the opposite of what we have been doing before. And to relate that to the classroom, what we do normally in classroom is that teachers teach in the classroom and students do assignments at home. But then when we flip it, what that means is that students now teach themselves or learn at home now. And then they come to class to come and work on what they have learned with the guidance of the teacher. So to divide this in a very simple manner, it would be that the flipped classroom methodology is just an approach to teaching, where teachers give students access to teaching materials before they come to class. And what would that help us to do? To help teachers to have more time to discuss and to help the students themselves to actually learn what they need to have and have a deeper understanding, just having the knowledge, but not knowing how to apply it. So they will have a deeper understanding of what they are learning, and also they will be able to
How popular is this practice, and how can it help us connect our needs as Africans to, what we teach in the school, so we don't have graduates who are consistently looking for non-existent jobs?
Wow. So let me start with the popularity. It's not that popular in Nigeria, even Africa generally, because it was, let me say, invented or discovered, not just discovered actually, but we can use the word refined less than 20 years ago in the USA. And then because is something that I've been practicing a long time, but in the absence of technology. So we add the flipped classroom, just like there's more affordable technology for us to actually work with that. Because what the flipped classroom emphasizes most of the time is that we don't need students that just know book alone. We want them to be able to think about what they are learning and to be able to do something about what they are doing. And so when we give students materials to go through at home, what we are doing for them is that we're giving them authority over their own learning. One thing I always say when I'm explaining is that as I'm talking right now, this is being recorded. But assuming this is not being recorded, the first time I said what I just said now is the last time. If you don't hear it well, you can hear it again. Okay. But if students have materials at home, because we don't learn at the same pace, they can go through it over and over and over. Now, if they have anything they don't understand yet, they can come to class where they will have their teachers analyze it and even want their peer to support them in learning. But in normal classroom, what we do is that teachers come together, they put everyone together in a classroom, teach them the same thing, and then they will go home, give them assignments to go and do where they have no support.
I want to take this back to our professors on Zoom. Doesn't this sound familiar and sort of mirrors what we used to have pre-colonial history, and it seems to run through all these different styles of education, the Montessori and what we hear now, the flipped classroom system. My question is, why can't we in fact, what can we do to make sure that the kind of education we have now mirrors a bit of who we are as Africans, where we want to get to? So when students get to the levels where you teach, they don't come out looking for non-existent jobs. Professor Monene.
Well, to start with, there is a fallacy, widespread fallacy, that the way to create jobs is to train people to be technical. Yet we have so many doctors and so many engineers and so many special technicians of this, and they're jobless. So the problem is not so much in the technical education they do not get or get. It is somewhere else. It is in the thinking zone, the policy-making people who may not be thinking well, or they may have problems thinking properly, because they are the ones who come up with these things that make no sense. And then you keep on hearing about graduates who are half-baked. Now, it is possible to reorient the thinking of the education. And that question is, what's the purpose of education, apart from reproducing self and identity? It is also to enable the person to be self-sustaining, to look after himself. Not so much to be given a job by somebody else, but to be able to survive, to move on and do what needs to be done for himself and for the community. That's the purpose of education. But when it is tailored to say that this person goes to school, gets a university degree, and must have a job waiting for him somewhere, that's a fallacy, because it doesn't work that way. So it's a
but isn't that how the training is structured right now? Because I studied sociology at the undergrad level, and nobody really took me through the process and said, you know, when you finish this, you can do ABC by yourselves. The idea was that I finish and then I look for a job in social work or something of that sort. So there is something at the core wrong with the style of education right now, isn't there?
Yeah, there was something wrong with that mentality, that you are training somebody to get a particular job or a particular line of a job. Not so much to look after himself or herself using the knowledge that was acquired in school or in the colleges, instead of waiting to be shepherded in a particular way. It is possible to get those things. We have reformers in Africa. There's no question about it. We have very good people who think through some problems and say, let's do this. And you ask them, why are they doing that? Because it came into their mind that something needs to be done. Even in the military zone, we have very good military reformers. One of the best in Eastern Africa just created the whole educational system in the military, Adetunji. And people say, how did he do it? It's just he saw this the reality. And then you're asking about the concept of the classroom. The classroom is a mental concept. It is not so much the four walls in a building. Because wherever people are taught as a group or in a small group or big groups, whether under a tree or in near some custody or wherever they are being taught and being exposed to knowledge, that is a classroom. So we don't need that in the four walls to think. So even when people are being taught to think philosophy in a particular area, whether sitting in a circle with some elders, tell them what things used to be or should be, that is new. And that's why we need to go back to that. So how to inculcate the values, the African values, the thinking, and that's why I think history is a critical subject. One of the tragedies we have in Africa, we don't teach history anymore.
And even if we do, it would seem that the history we teach begins from slavery.
Well, that's the problem. The history does not begin with slavery. It begins from the beginning.
Professor Ogunyemi, you're smiling. I'd like to hear what you're thinking. Professor Monene, just hold on for me. I want to hear what Professor Ogunyemi is thinking with that smile. Every time there's talk of history, it would appear that the African child begins from slavery. I wanted to take a bite out of that before I ask you any further questions.
I'm sorry, it's difficult getting you very straight. Did you say that Did our history actually begin from slavery?
I was asking why it would seem that if we have to teach the history of the continent to the African child, it always seems to begin from slavery. Why so, and what are the consequences of that?
Well, different colleges, different universities have different curriculum, if you like, different academic programs. But here at the Obafemi University, we know better than to start the teaching of the history of Africa from slavery. Actually, I mean, for how many years was slavery done? I mean, we begin to teach history from the prehistory of man, even before writing began. In other words, you start to teach history from archaeology. In other words, evidence of the material life of a people in some time past that are left in terms of potsherds, in terms of their arts, their crafts, which are buried underground, and then you excavate them, you test them using different methods. You can use the, if you like, the radiocarbon dating system, and then you will start to reconstruct the past using the technology that you have unearthed yourselves. But that should not be a problem. It is typical of Eurocentric scholars to begin to explore the history of Africa only from the perspective of their intervention in the transatlantic slave trade. But even the transatlantic slave trade came only after the trans-Saharan slave trade, in which Arabs were very, very active.
Indeed.
Of course, Arabs were great slavers, and most of the time, it was the black African that was enslaved. So I think what is very critical is that the time has begun, the time has come for us to begin to write our histories ourselves. See, the lack of the writing culture in most parts of the history of Africa before AD 1200 was the singular, most critical, damaging factor to the African history, its personality and self-respect. We never had a very good writing culture. I mean, writing skills were very scarce in Africa. It is true that we had hieroglyphics in Egypt, yes, and we had the insipid kind of writing amongst the Efik, particularly the secret society of the Ekpe and the Echo Society in Nigeria's Niger Delta. But these were not very popular. They belonged to the writing skills of the secret societies. Had it been that we had had the writing culture, a lot of our creativity would have been recorded by our past heroes. And this would form the basis, it would have formed the basis of the creation and innovation of subsequent generations of Africans. Unfortunately, we had that incalculable damage to our historical past.
Very well.
But not to worry, yes, from AD 1300 upwards, great scholars have emerged. And we have been able to reconstruct the history of Africa using oral tradition. Kenneth Onwuka-Dike was very outstanding in that. He reconstructed the whole of the history of the trade in the Niger Delta of Nigeria using only oral history. Kenneth Onwuka-Dike, PhD history in Ibadan, 1952, pioneered the use of oral history in Africa. And he has been followed by Adu Boahen, J.F. Ajayi, etc., etc., Anene, and the rest of them. So if you do not have the writing culture, you can reconstruct your history using archaeological findings, oral history, yes, and the art and crafts of your people that are represented in different creations.
Very well. There's never enough time to discuss a topic as this. I'll give the last word to Abdul Latif, who's here with me. Abdul Latif, talk to us about how you think that we can begin to merge the two types of education. What would it take to make this, as you said, it's here with us already. We've been practicing this for many years now. How can we make it better so that it better serves our needs as Africans?
Okay, so the first thing I would say is that, or one thing that Africans generally, what thing we must stop doing is that we must stop prioritizing evaluation of education over education itself. Because
what does that mean?
what that means basically is that, and that's why we have millions of jobless graduates out there, because the only thing they do when they are in school is that we pass exams. So the only way to know an educated person while in school is their exam score. But then in the society, it's not your exam score that will determine how much you have. And that's really the true sense of education. Because what would differentiate an educated person and an uneducated, who might be very literate, even more literate than the educated person, is what he or she can do for he or herself, not just what you have passed. Yeah, I have a first class degree.
By literate, you mean literacy in English? Because
yes, literacy.
You can be literate in Yoruba. I am illiterate in Yoruba because I cannot read or write. Yeah, yes, so make the point.
So literacy in, let's say, the Western languages. Okay, so what we need is that we need to prioritize education that builds up the thinking faculty, that focus more on the understanding and the application of what you are learning. Not just even the general application, but to our own needs. Where teachers don't just come to class, come and teach a particular topic, but they're able to relate it to the environment. And students themselves are able to contribute to what is going on in the classroom beyond just passing.
I'm so sorry we have to go now, but gentlemen, I am definitely grateful for your insights on the subject. Professor Adetunji Ogunyemi, Abdulateef Adedeji, you're here with me, and Professor Keminni Amanor. I am so grateful for your time. I'm very much appreciative of it. Thank you so much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. I know there's a lot more to discuss here on this subject, and perhaps we'll have a part 2 in the future. But remember that literacy is not only in the English language, and there are things in our roots, in our pre-colonial history, that we need to start to bring to the fore in this Western style of education that we have to better serve our purpose as Africans. My name is Keminni Amanor. I'll see you again same time tomorrow. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.